Good afternoon and welcome to ThinkTech Asia. It's Tuesday, April 14th, 2015. I'm your host, Keith Bettinger. A little later on in today's program, we'll be welcoming our guest, Dr. Paul Lavy, who joins us today at the ThinkTech complex from the University of Hawaii's Department of Art and Art History. Dr. Lavy and I will be discussing the fascinating connection between the beautiful and wondrous ancient wonders of Southeast Asia and the formation of national identity in modern states. We're also going to learn about what art and archaeology have to do with national borders and international relations. But before we begin, I'd like to welcome all our viewers from Wuhan, China, and I was really touched by the beautiful bouquet of peonies he sent. And as our legions of loyal viewers already know, in addition to our streaming broadcast, our program will be uploaded to YouTube later, so you can watch it again and again. And as always, if you have any Asia-related events to publicize, please contact me at keiththinktech@gmail.com. You can also send me questions and comments directly via Twitter at KCCGeography. And now on to our weekly news summary of important events around Asia. First to Southeast Asia, where the Philippines Department of Foreign Affairs this week declared that China's island building activities in the South China Sea have destroyed approximately 300 acres of coral reefs and have caused irreversible and widespread damage to the diversity and ecological balance of the South China Sea. Charles Jose, a spokesperson for the Department of Foreign Affairs, said that the damage could cost the Philippines up to $100 million per year since the damaged and destroyed reefs are breeding grounds for economically valuable fish. Johnson South Reef, where the island building is taking place, is part of the disputed Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. The Spratlys are claimed by China, the Philippines, Brunei, Taiwan, and Vietnam, and have been a source of tension for years. Johnson South Reef was the site of a skirmish between Vietnam and China in 1988, which resulted in more than 70 Vietnamese deaths, and the occupation of the reef by the People's Republic of China. In order to prevent the reef from submersion caused by erosion and to reinforce their claim to the exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, around the reef, the Chinese government has been building there since the 1990s. In 2014, the government of the Philippines said that reconnaissance indicated that the Chinese were expanding their dredging activities to expand the size of the reef in preparations for building a military airfield there. The Chinese government denied these claims, stating that they were instead building navigation aids, meteorological stations, and search and rescue centers there. Chinese activities in the South China Sea have also caught the attention of the United States, which last week announced that their annual joint military exercise with the Philippine Armed Forces would be the largest in 15 years, although the Philippine government announced that the expansion of the military exercise was not in response to the Chinese dredging. The Philippine government has also taken their case to an international tribunal in the Netherlands, but the Chinese have refused to take part in the adjudication proceedings. Many international law experts agree that China's activities are a violation of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now on to East Asia, where the government of the People's Republic of China has said that Taiwan will not be a member of a new regional bank, but that the island state, which the PRC views as a breakaway province, might be able to join a new bank under a different name. The news centers on the PRC's plans to set up the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB, a new multilateral development bank. Taiwan, which split from China in 1949, wanted to join the bank as an independent nation. The Taiwanese government has said that they will continue to press their case for inclusion. Taiwan, which officially calls itself the Republic of China, is recognized as Taipei China, or Chinese Taipei, by the Asian Development Bank, the International Olympic Committee, and other multilateral organizations. The purpose of the AIIB would be to provide investment funds at favorable rates to build infrastructure in developing countries, which is similar to one of the core missions of the World Bank. Analysts say that China wants to set up a new bank as a counterweight to the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other so-called Washington consensus institutions that are perceived to be dominated by Western interests and representative of neoliberal economic policies. China argues that it deserves a greater say in how development finance is governed, and that the new bank will allow Chinese capital to finance some of the estimated $8 trillion of investment the PRC says will be needed to continue the economic development of Asia. Many analysts agree that China needs to play a larger role more consistent with the size of its economy. For example, China currently has a 5.47% voting right in the Asian Development Bank, whereas the United States and Japan together have a 26% voting right. The United States has been quite critical of China's plans to establish the new bank, but so far nearly all Asian countries have joined the bank, and some key U.S. allies, including the United Kingdom, Australia, and South Korea, have signed up as well. Now on to South Asia. In India this week, the National Human Rights Commission has ordered an investigation into the killing of 20 alleged red sandalwood smugglers last week. According to police, the 20 men were killed last week in a skirmish with an anti-smuggling task force in the state of Andhra Pradesh. The police say that the skirmish broke out after they challenged a group of 100 smugglers who attacked them with axes and stones. However, witnesses from a local village dispute the police account, instead alleging that the killings were staged. They say that the dead had been detained when they were riding buses to a work site and then shot while in custody. Most of those killed are believed to be of the Tamil ethnic group, and there was an angry reaction in the state of Tamil Nadu to the incident. Red sandalwood is a species of tree endemic to the Western Ghat Mountains of India. The tree is sought for its red color and is used for making furniture and musical instruments, though it is a distinct species from the aromatic sandalwood that is native to another part of India. India banned the sale of red sandalwood in the year 2000. Sandalwood smuggling is a major illegal activity in southern India, with a ton of wood selling for tens of thousands of dollars on the international black market. Violent clashes have occasionally happened since the ban. The Red Sanders Anti-Smuggling Task Force, which carried out the operation, is at the heart of the controversy. This group was formed in the wake of a 2013 clash between loggers and forest officials in which 2 government officials were killed. Now on to our interview, and I'm very excited about our discussion today. Today we're discussing monuments, history, nationalism, and modern states in Southeast Asia. As many of our viewers know, Southeast Asia is home to some monumental relics and kingdoms and empires long since passed from this world. This includes Mataram on Java, which is remembered by the incredible art and architectural genius found at sites like Borobudur and Prambanan, and Srivijaya, whose ancient capital we can see in Jambi on Sumatra, and the Champa Kingdom with its stunning architectural signature at Mysore. And perhaps most famous, the Khmer civilization, which produced scores of monumental sites, but none which is more renowned than Angkor Wat, the brilliant 12th century capital of King Suravarman II, located at what is now Siem Reap in Cambodia. But these monuments are more than just vivid reminders of the flourishing epics of the past. They're also potent symbols of cultural and national identity. As such, they are used discursively in sometimes very contentious debates over sovereignty and statehood. This fascinating interface between art history and statecraft is the topic of today's discussion. So, joining me in the studio today, my guest this week is Dr. Paul Lavy, from the assistant professor at of art history at the department. Excuse me, I'm tripping over myself. I'm so excited about the program today. Assistant professor of art history in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Thank you very much for joining us today. I really honestly have to say that I've been looking forward to this discussion for weeks, and I've wanted to have you on the program ever since I started to do this show. So thank you for taking time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you, yeah. So prior to joining the faculty at the University of Hawaii, he taught ancient art history at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and Asian and Islamic art history at Pennsylvania State University at University Park. Dr. Lavy has conducted research in India and throughout Southeast Asia, particularly in Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam, where he lived for a couple of years. His ongoing research, which has been funded by the University of Hawaii Research Council, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Asian Cultural Council, and the National Security Education Program, investigates links between art and architecture and political history in early historic Southeast Asia. His primary interests are the Hindu-Buddhist artistic traditions associated with the Mekong Delta and the pre-Angkorian Khmer civilization and their relationship with the art of South Asia. He's currently researching and writing a book on early sculpture from Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia and Vietnam, entitled The Crown Gods of Early Southeast Asia. So is the book finished, or are you still working on it?
Finishing stages. I need to finish up procuring photographs, and we'll be ready to go probably by winter.
Oh, right on. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
That's a big milestone. Yeah?
It is, yeah.
Also, before we begin, do you say Khmer or Khmer?
Either one. The people of Cambodia refer to themselves as Khmer.
Khmer,
and
yeah.
Khmer is kind of a francophone version of Khmer.
It's right.
Of Khmer. Khmer.
So I'll say Khmer then, yeah. All right, so today, let's go ahead and get started, yeah? Today we're talking about nationalism and national symbols and the role of monuments and other historical, cultural resources in constructing national identities in Southeast Asia. Now, when one visits Thailand and Cambodia and Laos and other countries in mainland Southeast Asia, one of the things that's really hard to miss is how monuments like Angkor Wat and others, as you describe in your research, including Preah Vihear, are part of mainstream and everyday culture. Now, can you describe this phenomenon, possibly provide some examples? And I think we have some images that we're going to show here,
right.
Yeah?
It's positively ubiquitous, these images of the past that evoke these ancient civilizations, especially probably in Cambodia. Vietnam as well. You often go into cafes and see motifs appropriated from ancient kettle drums, dong sun drums. In Cambodia, images of Angkor Wat, the main temple of the Kingdom of Angkor, but other motifs, sculpture, references to Angkor are everywhere. They're in hotel designs, they're on cigarette ads, they're on beer, a couple of beer brands. They're used not only on the labels, but in the advertising campaigns. You find them in rap songs referred to. There's
Really?
even a Preah Vihear rap song that goes through the chronology of the contested site in
Wow.
Khmer rap. There are music videos based on it. But it's kind of ironic because on the other hand, you know, there's also contestations over the use of these images.
Sure.
So on the one hand, while you find images, especially of Angkor Wat everywhere, you know, often almost every Khmer person's house, there's a framed image, a postcard or a calendar. On the other hand, I think it was in 2007, the government had a kind of sweeping campaign to retract a bunch of playing cards that had temples of Angkor, including Angkor Wat on them. The argument being that playing cards are used for gambling and kind of checkered locations and
right?
are likely
So it's
to
a
end up on the
moral
floor
issue. Yeah.
and maybe stepped upon. Right.
So we have a couple of pictures that I think will come up in a moment. One of them is of Angkor beer, which is delicious. Yeah,
Quite good after you come in from a day of temple.
Yeah, exactly,
temple
right? I think that the environment makes it taste all the better. Here it is.
Right.
And this is not an advertisement, but this is an illustration of the point that we're making.
Right.
And we'll also have a picture, I think, of Angkor cigarettes. And if people are just tuning in, they're probably getting the impression that we're promoting all sorts of vice on this program,
Indeed.
which we're not
Gambling.
doing. This is just to illustrate the point that Angkor Wat well, it's in cigarettes, and it's every place, right? That's quite interesting. So now, to follow up there, if it's on playing cards, it's immoral. Why is it okay to put it on cigarettes?
Good question. And I don't have clear insight into that, but I think my educated assumption is that if the proper channels are followed, if people are being paid in the correct way, the image and the logo is to be had.
Right.
On the other hand, if perhaps the overseers of these products that attempt to use these images don't follow the correct channels, politically or economically, then probably they're going to suffer reprisal.
Right.
And a good example is the little guy. The average Joe may not be quite as able to use the image. We have a great example. In 2009, a Thai gentleman living in Cambodia illegally for 10 years was arrested and deported. This is Poi Phet, the area of the border between countries. He was deported, and of course he'd been living there illegally, but the big story and what seemed to drive the story about this sort of controversy wasn't that he was an illegal Thai resident of Cambodia. There are many of those. But that he had decided to decorate his bathroom floor with an image of Angkor Wat that he had kind of carved into the wet concrete.
Wow.
On the bathroom floor, under your feet. That's perceived as degrading, disrespectful. He himself said he did it because he thought it was beautiful and he wanted to decorate his bathroom.
Sure.
So there's a lot of tensions and contrasts, right? I mean, if you're kind of connected and you have the right sort of people on your side and you pay the right people, you can do what you want.
Right. Well, that's really interesting. That makes a lot of sense based on experience in the region. And you know, one of the things that the Angkor cigarettes ad reminds me of is kind of the Marlboro Man campaign here. It seems like there's this same kind of Marlboro Man is really indicative of rugged individualism, and that's why it was so successful, I think. And here we see the same thing, only it's it's referencing that mythical past, right? That deep history of discursive history of Cambodia. So now one of the things you alluded to in your analysis of Benedict Anderson, I really like this, by the way, one of the things you alluded to in your analysis of Benedict Anderson's notion of the imagined community, which refers to the curious connection that people tend to feel with others of the same nationality. You talked about that. You also mentioned the development of the geobody in Southeast Asia, and I think that this is a reference to Winnechaco and Siam mapped. And his description of how modern states came to be in Southeast Asia. Now, can you talk a little bit about what history has meant for the development of national identities in Southeast Asia, especially material markers such as temples and other sites?
It's been quite profound, as it has been throughout the world. So I don't want to sort of give the impression that Southeast Asia is somehow a completely exceptional case. Of course, history is pivotal to national imaginings and identities all throughout the world, including Hawaii.
Right.
But I'm a Southeast Asianist, and so that is my focus. And I do, as an art historian, I notice a striking correlation between the importance of history and especially of monumental sites in Southeast Asia, perhaps more so, arguably, than anywhere else in the world. I mean, Cambodia is a great example. Its national flag is really the only national flag in the world that has a built monument on it. It has the iconic towers of Angkor Wat.
Right in the middle, right.
In fact, all throughout Southeast Asia, you find this sort of cultivation of classical periods that are focused on, as you find in other parts of the world. Indonesia, of course, with the great kingdom of Majapahit. Myanmar with the great kingdom of Pagan.
Right.
You know, the Vietnamese look to particular dynastic periods. The Thais look to Sukhothai. The Lao to the Lansang kingdom, and Cambodia to Angkor. In many cases, these associations are not just to an historical period, but are also to sites, centers, political centers, ritual centers in the past that served a myriad of purposes. They were the centers of royalty. They were educational, political, religious centers. They were sacred sites. And it's become sort of the practice through colonial sort of interactions, which I guess we'll talk about. These sites became sort of selected and emphasized in new ways as lodestones of national identity, tying people and often ethnic groups into continuities with these past kingdoms all over the region, very powerfully.
Oh, well, that's fascinating. Well, what we're going to do, we're going to take our first break. The time is flying by already. Yeah, this is really interesting. Thank you for joining us. This is ThinkTech Asia. We'll be back in just a moment, so please don't go anywhere.
Inspired by an ancient culture, classical Chinese dance, vigorous physicality, timeless stories, 5,000 years of Chinese music and dance, Shen Yun presents authentic Chinese culture. Coming to Blaisdell Concert Hall, May 8th and 9th. Tickets at shenyun.com or call 808-792-3919.
This is Alice Lee Hagen, host of ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My show here at ThinkTech Hawaii is every Thursday from 3 to 4 in the afternoon. I bring in interesting guests from Hawaii, the mainland, and hopefully international guests in the future. Do join us on Thursday from 3 to 4 p.m. ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. Aloha.
Hi, I'm your host on ThinkTech Asia, Bill Sharp. I look forward to you joining us each Monday between 4 and 5 o'clock when we film right here in our studio in downtown Honolulu. The show, ThinkTech Asia, focuses on contemporary events in Asia. And by Asia, we mean anything from Hawaii, south to Australia and New Zealand, west to Pakistan, and as far north as the Russian Far East. Clearly, this is one of the most economically dynamic centers of the world, and we bring you up to date on what's going on in a whole host of countries in this very vital region. We look forward to seeing you. Aloha.
Okay, welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Keith Bettinger, and today we're having a fascinating discussion with Dr. Paul Lavy from the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And what we're talking about today is well, the monuments of Southeast Asia, like Angkor Wat, Mysore, and the other monumental sites, but the role that these have in national discourses and the construction of national identities and nationalism. And it's really a fascinating topic because these identities have kind of been constructed. So now, as states like Cambodia, which is it's a relatively recent invention, like Indonesia, for example. Indonesia is essentially a post-colonial invention. And there were those that would argue with me on that,
Of course, they would all differ with that.
But Vietnam and Laos, and the only one that was never colonized there is Thailand, or Siam, right? So as these states have emerged in the post-colonial era, and borders have been reified, borders have been laid down, and we associate now certain historical kingdoms and epics and empires with current geopolitical units. For example, the Khmer with Cambodia, the Champa with Vietnam, specifically the southern part of Vietnam, I think, and Bagan with Burma, Preah Vihear with Indonesia. Now, in your mind, is this a simplification of history, and if so, implications of that simplified history?
Yeah, I think it's quite a lot of simplification. All of these countries that you mentioned were very much transformed through the process and engagement of the colonial period, including Thailand, even though, of course, one of the essential aspects of Thai identity is the idea that they weren't colonized. It's one of the things that's foregrounded in the identity. It's nevertheless the case, as many Thai scholars and academics have themselves argued, that Thailand was nevertheless shaped by colonization, not only on their borders, for example, by the British in Burma or by the French in Indo-China, but also by Thai elites and kings themselves who basically adopted all of these sort of colonial institutions and frames for thinking and organizing the past, much in the same way that the colonized areas did. So similar things going on in Cambodia and Thailand and Laos through the colonial engagement. I don't want it to sound like it's simply something that happened to these folks as a result of being colonized, because in fact there was a lot of collaboration by the elites in these places, because one of the ways that colonization succeeded in the region was by tapping into kind of elite desires and concerns and then collaborating together. But it is a simplification, I think, to link too closely contemporary political permutations of the nation state to these political formations in the past. Of course, there's continuity. There's ethnic continuity, there's linguistic continuity, historical continuity. But I think it oversimplifies and does a disservice to people when you draw direct connections of direct links, for example, between Angkor and Cambodia. This has led to a kind of a discourse that was really primarily developed by the French during the colonial period, whereby the Cambodians were often seen by the French as kind of decadent, downgraded versions of their past prior glory. They had this great legacy of Angkor as inscribed in these wonderful monuments. And now the French come along and what they find is a considerably reduced state, if you're considering it to be some descendant of this last state. And what was then developed was a discourse of vanishing, the feeling that you see this often in the 20th century and to the present, in fact, in Khmer political discourse, the idea that they're a vanishing race and that they need to aspire to this past legacy of greatness, which is really kind of an unfortunate albatross to kind of shackle around people's necks. And the French did that in very specific ways sometimes, because rather than sort of educating the people in 20th century terms during the colonial process, for example, in the arts, they didn't encourage Cambodian artisans to be creative or to engage with the 20th century world, but rather to copy images from old Angkor, which they're very good at, of course. But I think you could argue it led to a kind of a certain stunting of the development of the country, that it's still a kind of legacy of colonialism and a shadow, a specter that we have.
Well, that's quite interesting. One of the other things I think that's quite interesting, I recall Winnechako's work, which you're familiar with, is this notion, and it's prevalent in the literature of the pre-modern polity in Southeast Asia and the concept of the mandala, where these reified borders, lines on a map, were kind of alien to the way that people thought about power and the way that they thought about their state. And this notion of the mandala is that, well, the further you go from the capital, the more diminished the power is. So eventually you get to, the power attenuates. And I recall an anecdote that Winnechaco writes in Siam Mapped about, and you mentioned that Siam adopted a lot of the trappings of the colonial powers. But when the colonial powers were first venturing into the region, making their claims, they wanted to know where Siam stopped.
Right.
And they asked the king, and the king was really perturbed by this "where's your borders" question. They'd never thought about borders before, and he told the French and the British to keep walking and ask the people, and when they tell you that they're no longer in Siam, that's when you're no longer in Siam. I always thought that that was a very good illustration of kind of the mindset of a completely different paradigm for thinking about power.
Yeah, certainly they had an idea of territory. They understood maintaining kind of buffer zones often between kingdoms, but these kingdoms were constantly oscillating.
Right.
And so often the terms are used like concertina fashion or galactic polity. They pulsated, and power sort of ebbed and flowed as kings rose and marshaled their resources and married influential people and waged war. But their power would be evanescent and kind of shade off and diminish. Generally, they didn't have a concept of the linear borders, and that certainly was an aspect of the colonial period that was imposed, as you say, into the region.
And that kind of gets to the heart of equating a country like Cambodia with the Khmer polity. It's because the Khmer polity, at various times during its several hundred years, 700-year existence, I think.
If you think about Angkor, typically it's said to be established in the early 9th century and to finally have diminished in the 15th century.
In the 15th, so 600 years, roughly, yeah? It's a long period of time, but its dominion would, like you said, would change. I like that concertina metaphor. That's interesting. And so to equate Cambodia, the current borders of Cambodia, with that is kind of a misnomer.
Certainly, but it can also fuel then irredentism, of course.
That's true, yes.
And that's certainly been a case in Southeast Asian politics, particularly in the mid-20th century, but ongoing issues over borders and claims on land based on the attachments to the past, these past formations of political power, and the idea that because they control this zone of territory, that somehow then we should have some prior claim. It's fueling many territorial disputes in the region.
Sure. All right, so now you've conducted a lot of research about Preah Vihear, which is it's a sacred Khmer site that was active between the 9th and 13th centuries, if I'm not mistaken. And it's currently situated in Cambodia, but it's very close to the Thai border. Now, for decades, the quote-unquote ownership of this site has been a bone of contention between the two countries. And you have described the importance of a 1962 International Court decision. Now, could you describe the history of this conflict and maybe the role of the colonial experience in that? I know you referenced a 1907 map that kind of has set the stage for some of this conflict, and it's still ongoing. It's still festering.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about this one?
Yeah, it's a complex subject. Essentially, Preah Vihear is primarily an 11th century temple built on a 500-meter precipice of the Dang Rek Mountains. Its geographic circumstances are incredibly unique and unusual. It literally sits on the border of these two countries, no matter how you want to parse the border. And its back of the temple is a 1,500-foot sheer drop off a cliff into Cambodia, and then the site sort of sits and leans gently down into Thailand. This was a site that was a Hindu sacred site dedicated to Shiva and built mainly in the 11th century, pretty much went out of use, became sort of turned into a Buddhist site as Cambodia itself transitioned more towards Buddhism in the post-Angkorian period. But largely it was kind of ignored and became a kind of no man's land inhabited mostly by sort of some local villagers and Kui people, a kind of ethnic minority today in Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia, famed for their old ironworking and elephant hunting, largely ignored in the national discourse and the controversies over that. Really, the debate only happened as a result of decolonization. When Cambodia gained its independence in 1953, it attempted to assert its control over this site based on its understanding of its borders derived from French colonial history. But the Thais had occupied the site militarily.
Now we have, what we're showing here on the screen is, if I'm not mistaken, this is in 1907.
This is correct. This is the map that was determined as a series of treaties done between then Siam, Thailand was then Siam, and French Indo-China. French Indochina used kind of gunboat diplomacy to secure its own territorial designs in Southeast Asia, sometimes and often at the expense of the Siamese. The area in which many of these Angkorian ruins are located, including Angkor Wat and Preah Vihear, had been loosely administered by the kings of Siam since the 1790s.
Wow.
So when the French are arriving here now, 1860 and after, they're interested in securing these lands because of their monumental ruins, working with the Cambodian king in Phnom Penh to theoretically reconstitute this Angkorian empire as their now colony to be proud of. One of the ways that they secured the French, or they got the Siamese elites and kings to remove their claims on these lands was by gunboat diplomacy, actually threatening Bangkok and seizing more central Thai lands that they were traded upon, basically.
So this area was part of Siam administered
very
territory.
very loosely. In the 1790s, northern and western Cambodia became sort of distantly administered from the royal court in Bangkok by the Siamese kings, but through, in fact, local Khmer governors. But they certainly claimed it.
Sure.
And so the French needed to get the official claim renounced so that they could effectively colonize and claim it for their own sort of, as a tool
and their
in
motivation to
colonial
do that was control of these sites.
Primarily, they were trying to colonize Cambodia. French colonizers brought a lot of their own baggage.
Right.
One of which was their loss in 1871, I guess it was in the Franco-Prussian War, where Prussia seized Alsace-Lorraine. The French came into Cambodia right around this time. They're colonizing it, and you frequently see mentions of the feelings of, late 19th century degeneracy in Parisian society and the loss of French territories at the expense of the rising Germanic power. Now we've lost our territories, but we can regain Cambodia's. It was also in effect a kind of compensation prize for the loss of France's territories
So maybe some
in
domestic
India as well.
politics in France.
Oh, a lot of what the French did with regard to their valuing of the monuments in the historical period was to transpose a lot of their own feelings and some of their own regrets and insecurities into the Cambodian situation.
Wow, that's fascinating, that connection.
So the map was part of a treaty that was forced upon the Siamese by the French Indo-Chinese authorities to delineate the border. And of course, the map is contentious because it put Preah Vihear on the Cambodian side of the border in contravention of the treaty.
I see.
Where the line should have followed the watershed. That's which direction the water flows off the mountain, which by almost all accounts would put it in Thailand.
I see. Now, we'll pick up there in just a moment. I really want to continue that topic. We've got to take another break. We'll be right back. This is ThinkTech Asia. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back.
Aloha. My name is Josh Green. I'm a senator from the Big Island in the ER position. Every other Tuesday, I get to host a show here on the ThinkTech program about healthcare. We call it Healthcare in Hawaii. It's really enjoyable for me to bring other healthcare leaders from around the state to talk about our pressing issues. Hawaii has long been the health state, but we need to keep up the momentum, the inertia, and with your help and with your participation, we can come and share all of the big issues that are pressing day to day. Thanks for joining us every Tuesday, alternating weeks from 2 to 2:45.
Hi, I'm Ethan Allen. I host Likeable Science on ThinkTech Hawaii, and I do this because I care about science literacy in Hawaii. I want to spread the understanding that science is a vital and interesting part of everyone's life. I want to make sure the broadest possible spectrum of people understand the beauty and the value of science and realize that science plays out each and every day of their lives. I want you to understand that science is fun. So we bring onto this show each week guests who are scientists, from astronomers to zoologists, and we talk about what they do and how they do it. But most importantly, we talk about why you should care about their work, why you should see that their work has value and impact on your life. So I hope you'll join us Fridays, 1 p.m. here on ThinkTech Hawaii. You can watch us via live stream. You can watch us recorded on Olelo, and you can see us each week. We hope you'll join us.
Okay, welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Keith Bettinger, and we really are having an incredible conversation today. They could go on and on and on about nationalism. We're talking about Preah Vihear, which is a site right there at the border of Thailand and Cambodia. And we were talking about this contentious history, and where we left off before we went to break, I think that we were talking about this the way that the French gained control of this during the colonial era. So would you like to pick up, continue that thought?
Sure, yeah. So the map that we were showing previously, it was derived from treaties that attempted to impose new linear borders, territorial borders into an area where they previously hadn't existed. Here we have the map again. This map arose from a treaty in which the stipulation was a mixed border commission, delimitation commission would create this map. Because at the time, the Siamese elites and kings didn't really care that much for maps. They probably didn't understand them entirely, and probably if they would have had scientific maps, couldn't have really read them very effectively. They had their own traditions of mapping,
Sure.
but not these. They said to the French, have at it. And so it was a French, a Lieutenant Colonel Bernard with his Khmer associate who essentially mapped the border. And he made the decision, essentially a personal decision, to diverge from the provisions of the treaty to put this temple in Cambodia rather than in Thailand. The maps, in fact, were sent to the court in Bangkok, and they accepted them and requested more, because they thought it was convenient to have them. At the time, they didn't notice the discrepancy, and even if they had, they probably wouldn't have thought much of it. Oh, it's a little error kind of thing. What happened to bring all of this into conflict and tension was transformations when we moved 50 years forward, basically into the mid-20th century. This is a period in the World War II era where Thailand is quite heavily nationalistic. In fact, they allied themselves with the Japanese in World War II. And through Japanese assistance, they tried to re-secure all the lands they had ceded to French Indo-China in 1941. In fact, they did, most of them, though not Angkor Wat. The Japanese media didn't give them that. Preah Vihear was a kind of compensation prize for the Thai at that point.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, and so they positioned troops, and actually right around this time in 1939, 1940, 1934-35, they did a new map where they claimed Preah Vihear for themselves. By 1939, were repudiating the 1907 map
So by the
Vihear as a
beginning
national
of World
monument.
War II, the Thais had recognized the significance of this site.
On the eve of World War II.
I see.
Yeah. And this was a period of rapid kind of nationalization developing under Pibun Songkran's rule as prime minister in Thailand. Of course, when Cambodia gained its independence in 1953 from France, following World War II, they were concerned that they assert their national interest, their new national interest. This is now under the very famous King Norodom Sihanouk, the first prime minister then, who used Angkor as his to cloak himself in history as a legitimate ruling king, and as an assertion of newly independent Khmer identity, identifying with Angkor. When they attempted to gain control of the site physically, they found that it was policed by Thai soldiers. And this led to escalating tensions through the late 50s. Finally, 1959 and 1962, Cambodia brought Thailand before the International Court of Justice to get them to adjudicate this dispute. Of course, famously, notoriously from the Thai perspective, the court found in favor of Cambodia.
I see.
And ruled that, in fact, the temple's in Cambodia. But even to this day, this has not been entirely agreed upon, certainly not accepted.
But at that time,
by
in
Thailand.
1962, the Thai government officially acceded to that.
They officially recognized it, but they resisted in various ways of everyday forms of resistance kind of thing. Instead of taking down their flag from the site, they removed it still flying from the flagpole and relocated the flagpole to a nearby military installation. So they basically said, okay, it's yours if that's what the court says. But they never really kind of accepted the idea that sovereignty really lied with Cambodia, particularly the question about the surrounding and immediately adjacent territory. So because of ambiguity that certainly there was from the court's decision itself, but also from parsing of the decision in various ways, whenever it's been convenient at various points historically in the last several decades, the issue has raised its head as a kind of way to gain political traction. Really,
so that's domestic politics at play.
Domestic, but also between the two countries. It's also bilateral, because what really brought it to a head, of course, was Cambodia finally gaining a measure of peace after decades of war. It was a kind of side effect and sideshow, as famously known from the Vietnam War era, and the Khmer Rouge devastating regime in the 1970s, still holding out as guerrillas until the late 90s, and using Preah Vihear as a base. Finally, they surrendered in 1997, and Cambodia immediately moved to try to get Preah Vihear listed as a World Heritage Site. Initially, there was some sense that there could be a bilateral kind of relation, maybe a joint listing with Thailand or something like that. And hopes were in that way for several years, but in 2007, 2008, Cambodia unilaterally had sought to have World Heritage status bestowed on Preah Vihear. Now, this gets into the domestic politics of Thailand, because initially it was Thai politicians associated with the now ousted Thaksin Shinawat's party and his descendants and his associates that seemingly brokered a deal in which Cambodia could go ahead and proceed with this unilateral listing. But he was ousted in a coup in the meantime, as were subsequent sort of proxies of his. And it basically flipped around and sort of then under Apisit in Thailand for a couple of years, 2008, 2009, 2010, 11. There's controversy now where the issue of Preah Vihear is used to diminish Thaksin by saying that he was giving away Thailand. He was ceding
a
Thailand.
Weak leader. He's
another reason to get rid of him,
sure.
and national humiliation and all of that. And it's still unresolved. This led to armed disputes at the site. Most prominently, right after, in 2008, perhaps problematically, UNESCO went ahead and listed it, the site, for Cambodia. And this really escalated tensions. There was fighting on the border. Thousands of people have been displaced. Dozens injured and killed on both sides, including military on both sides, in conflagrations, mainly in 2008, 2009, 2011.
So we have about a minute and a half left. And so right now, could you briefly tell us what's going on?
Yeah, for a brief spell, things calmed down. Apisit was replaced, of course, by Thaksin's sister, Yingluck, who was conciliatory with Cambodia and met with Prime Minister Hun Sen in Cambodia, and things were looking prominent. They agreed that they were going to sort the border out, but they were going to do it in reverse order of problems. So that meant they'd kick the Preah Vihear case down the road in order to focus on less contentious areas. Of course, she was ousted in a coup last May, May 2014. So now we have a military government in place in Thailand that just lifted martial law 2 weeks ago, but still has invoked an article that gives them kind of unlimited power. The situation is unclear. There was a meeting, of course, the Prayut, the prime minister now of Thailand, visited Cambodia in October of 2014. But it was all pomp and circumstance and really wasn't about sorting any of this out. So because Thailand now is back to a state of being consumed with its own internal issues, as is typically the case over the last several decades, the situation at Preah Vihear kind of dies down. But you can bet that unless both countries and stakeholders on both sides of the border agree to resolve it, that when it's convenient, the issue will be raised again. And you can almost guarantee it.
Well, it seems like from what I know about Hun Sen and the Cambodian regime, and from what I know about the Thai military regime, that it's somewhat convenient to kind of have this thing that you can, this issue that you can go to.
It certainly has been used. I don't know if you remember in 2003, a mob in Cambodia burned down the Thai embassy. And this happened as a result, purportedly, of a very prominent Thai soap opera star, very popular in Cambodia,
and she said it both.
Who said Angkor Wat needed to belong to Thailand, This was never proven. She never said this. It seems, I don't know, but the commentators on this seem to suggest that this was an internally raised matter that was completely fabricated, and however you want to argue his role in the situation, certainly Hun Sen benefited from the riot.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, Paul, thanks very much.
Thank you for having me. It's been an honor to be
for being here. And we're out of time, which I told you the time was just going to fly by. It always does when you're talking about something that you really are interested in. This is a fascinating topic. But that does it for ThinkTech Asia this week. Thank you for joining us. I know we've learned a lot. I want to express a special mahalo to my guest, Dr. Paul Lavy, for taking the time to be here today. I also want to thank Jay and Zuri and Sachi for making the show possible. And we hope and thank you also for tuning in. We hope you'll all join us again next week at 4 p.m. on Tuesday for another exciting and informative episode of ThinkTech Asia. Mahalo. Aloha and ahui ho.